Okay, cool. So today we're going to do a lecture on the social meaning of travel and tourism. Now, because many of you are researching the topic of tourism, I thought that it would be appropriate to provide to you a perspective from the social sciences rather than from the School of Business or from an economic perspective purely. Because nowadays, most of the essays that students tend to write about tourism are either at the School of Economics or at the School of Tourism or at the School of Hospitality and Management. So I thought that we would look into a perspective of tourism that's slightly different and that's looking at the actual social meaning of it. How can we understand the world better by looking at tourism as a phenomenon and vice versa. So the purpose of the lecture is first of all to give you an overview of the field of tourism from a social scientific perspective, and secondly to help you actually clarify some of the concepts that you might need to understand better for your research, and thirdly I will try to convince you that sociological theories are a useful tool for understanding tourism. So the lecture will have 4 parts. And in the first part, we will look at the history of tourism very briefly, and we're going to look at some useful definitions and distinctions between different concepts related to tourism. In the second part, I will try to convince you that modernity as a historical phenomenon transformed travel into tourism. So in that part of the lecture, I'll explain to you what modernity is, and whether there is a distinction between travel and tourism, and how that transformation happened. In the third part of the lecture, I will talk about post-modernity. So what happens after modernity, and how does that relate to tourism and to our society as a whole. So finally, in the fourth part of the lecture, I will go again through the social meanings of tourism briefly, from both a social perspective and an individual perspective. So, to get us started, let's look into a historical overview of tourism very briefly. So, we know quite a lot about ancient travel and ancient maps. So, for instance, there is a great database which is essentially Google Maps for the Roman Empire, by Stanford University, where you can see all of the roads that they had within the empire and how people traveled along these roads. So it tells you very cool things like how many days it would take you to get from one city to the next one, what's the shortest way to get from one city to the next one, etc. So really, this refers to a form of early travel. And that was a phenomenon within all of the ancient empires. So it was similar, for instance, in the Chinese Empire, where you would have a lot of people, for example, going to the cities to take an imperial exam if they wanted to be an official in the government. In the Roman Empire, clearly you can see the routes that people traveled here. So within ancient times, we had the phenomenon of travel, which was quite developed, but then again, it was within empires, so it was always domestic travel, and this was for a few reasons. One of them was that you had roads, so you had infrastructure on which people could travel. Another reason is that you had coins that were accepted within the empire, so you had a common currency that people could use to exchange value within the empire. And also another thing to consider is that people in the ancient world usually traveled with some sort of a purpose. So they wouldn't necessarily go and travel for leisure. Like the example that we just spoke about, in ancient China, they would go there to take an exam. Or they would go there for a specific purpose. Why? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, it took you a long time to travel, and two, it took you a lot of resources. So especially in ancient times, resources were not particularly ample for people. So this here, when we talk about the purpose of travel, refers both to the elites and the masses at some level. So when we talk about ancient travel, you have to consider the fact that the masses back then and the elites had access to very different types of resources. So most of the great travelers of the ancient world were people from the elites, whereas the masses would find it much harder to travel, and they would rarely travel. Also because a lot of the people were agricultural workers, so they would have farms, or they would have cattle or land that they worked on. So they really found it much more troublesome to travel. Now, in the Middle Ages, if you look at Europe, that trend started to change. So when you look at the decline of the Roman Empire at that period, one of the consequences was that the roads started to deteriorate. So when you think about how infrastructure gets developed, historically it's usually large states or superstructures that tend to invest in infrastructure on a large scale, whereas small dispersed communities have a much harder time building infrastructure. And if you look at the world map today, you're going to discover the same thing, that great power countries have very developed infrastructure internally, whereas regions that are more broken up within smaller countries have much worse infrastructure overall. So during the Middle Ages, there was a decline in the trend of travel in general in Europe. Now, this again is not applicable to the whole world. So, for instance, if you look at the same time period in China with the Song Dynasty, there was an emergence of specific travel writing genres. So, for instance, 有机文学, which means travel literature. So basically records on my travel. And that was very different from Europe at the time, because the Middle Ages were a particularly dark period for Europe, but not necessarily for the rest of the world. So going back to Europe, after the end of the Middle Ages, we entered what we call the Grand Tour era of travel, where a lot of young people would go on educational trips. So especially if you could afford it, of course. And if you were in your 20s, you would go on a trip for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So these were forms of travel that were specific to the purpose of learning more about the world and educating yourself. Now, when we talk about these things, we're mainly talking about travel on a very long time period compared to today. So the time that it took you to get to places was much longer than today. The time that you spent in places was much longer than today. So that's one of the concepts that we're going to come back to in a little bit when we try and talk about the differences between travel and tourism, or whether there are any at all, in your opinion. So how do we know about travel in earlier times? Well, we've had many great travel writers, but if we look at some of them and their backgrounds, so whether you're looking at Gerald of Wales, who was an archdeacon, or Ibn Battuta, or Fan Chongda, they were coming from a certain elite class of people. So for instance, Gerald of Wales had the support of the church behind him. So he was a highly ranked person within the church, and this is why he was able to afford to go and travel. Same with Ibn Battuta, who was a scholar, Fan Chongda, who was a government official. So they traveled usually for purposes related to work, and they used the resources of these large organizations to travel. Now, travel writings are a very interesting subject of study, because as Bill Buford, the author, says, travel writing lies between fact and fiction. So what does he mean by that? Well, of course, there's a part of travel writing that is based in fact, because you went there and experienced something and you saw something, and that is clearly a part of the experience. But then at the same time, you have a whole number of sources of what he calls wonderful ambiguity. So for instance, you have the concept of false memories. You don't always remember clearly what you saw when you were traveling. You also have the problem of misunderstanding or partial understanding. You're traveling in an unfamiliar environment, so you don't necessarily have a clear idea of what's going on there. You might be adding information for various purposes, so you might be intentionally doing this because this is a part of the way that you express yourself in writing. Or you might just have a subjective perception. So when you think of travel writings, if you look at, for instance, colonial travel writings, they're always talking about the self and the other, the me and the they. So the way that the local people in a certain place do things are usually described in contrast to the way that we, the self, the travelers, do things. So if you look at travel writing, there is also this subjectivity that's really everywhere. It's always from a certain person's point of view. And also, of course, you have the issue of language. So language is clearly imperfect. You don't necessarily express exactly what you're thinking, but you're limited within the scope of words that you can use. So when you're looking at these things, one of the main problems that I want to point out to you is, are these writings about travel or either about tourism? So when you had an ancient scholar or a poet sitting at a lake, looking at it, writing about it, was this a form of travel or was this a form of tourism? And is there really a difference between the two? So when you look at the two conceptually, one of the common starting points that I use when I look at different concepts is the language behind them. So if you look at the way that the word tourist developed, for instance, in the English language, we can see that, first of all, it appeared fairly late. So it appeared in the 18th century. But secondly, it wasn't really a word that people used very often or very frequently back then. So if you look at this graph right here, you have a frequency of word use in English and you have a number of words that are mapped out. So if you look at words like visit, travel, journey, trip, which are all clearly travel related, they were used much more often throughout the years than the word tourism, or for that matter, the word holiday. So if you look at the way that the word tourism started to get used in English, it was really during the 60s that it picked up. Before that, you had a number of other words. So for instance, you had the word hospitality, which was very commonly used. But the word hospitality doesn't necessarily relate to tourism. It relates to welcoming people in a certain place. So where the word tourism came from, we don't really know, but we can have a fair guess that it came from Greek and Latin words for circle and turn, meaning for people going somewhere, going in a circle, and going back to their place of origin. So, looking into the frequency of word use in English is one of the ways to actually get a starting point in terms of understanding how and when tourism started to develop. So clearly, if you're using a word more often, then this is probably a sign that the phenomenon is becoming more common in society. But the thing is that you can do the same thing with a lot of languages, and it's not only English. So if you look at languages like Chinese and French, which come from very different parts of the world, if you look at the word "旅游," which means travel, it really picked up right here, starting in what is 1978. So what happened in 78 in China? Yeah. Right, opening up. So really when the word itself, and I'm not even talking about people traveling, I'm talking about the word at all being used, was the starting point here was really the Reform and opening period. So if you look at how the word tourisme in French started being used as opposed to the word voyage, meaning journey, there's again a very interesting path here. So in French, it started being used a lot more gradually. So if you look at, for instance, the interwar period between the two wars, World War I and World War II, there was clearly much more of a rise in the way that people use the word tourisme. So when we're looking at these graphs of language, there are really a few points here to take away. So first of all, the rise of tourism seems to be a global phenomenon. So you can go onto the Anagram viewer and you can try this with all kinds of languages, and you're probably going to see the same path when you put the words for tourism. Now the second point is that you really see different points where tourism starts to pick up. So in the UK, well, in English, not in the UK, which includes the US and the UK obviously, it started picking up after the 60s. In France it was much more gradual. In China it was after the Reform and opening up. So these language graphs, of course that doesn't constitute proper research, but they give you a good starting point as an idea of what was going on. And of course this is a process that you can repeat for any kind of topic, any kind of word, any kind of phenomenon. So what was really tourism? What is tourism? Well, there are numerous definitions, and what I've really put here is perhaps one of the most common ones by the United Nations World Tourism Organization. And the definition seems to be fairly comprehensive. So it tells you that it's a social, cultural, and economic phenomenon. So this basically includes all conceivable aspects of society. It also tells you that it's related to travel for personal or business purposes. So that includes pretty much any form of travel. It also tells you that tourism has to do with the activities that people do at their point of arrival. And that includes tourism expenditure. So in that way, it is by definition related to the economy. Now, here's a question. Do you believe that definition? Who wrote it? When did they write it? And why? So, if you think about how definitions get formed and designed, it's not really a matter of having something defined or not defined. It's a matter of who defines it, how did they define it, and why did they define it that way. So, for instance, does it have to do with the measurement of tourism? Do we want to show that there is constant growth in tourism? And this is why we included all sorts of purposes for traveling. Because there are many people that would argue that business travel is not tourism. So, who made that definition? Why did they make it? So second of all, first of all, is it accurate? Second of all, is it useful? So it might be useful to the United Nations to show that there is a rise in tourism, and that's great. Is it useful to you when you're doing social science research? Based on that definition, can you define a specific scope of research? Or is it too broad? And again, these are questions that apply to any definition. So definitions are not something to take as a given, it is something to interpret for you. Also, when did they set it? Why did they set it like this? So when they talk about tourism expenditure, is this a phenomenon that had to do with the specific time period when they set it? So if you look at tourism in a different time and place, or rather if you look at travel in a different time and place, you might see a very different picture. So if you look, for instance, at the way that the Bedouins, which are people of the desert, how they treat their guests, the idea there is that if you see a guest or somebody that's coming into your tribe or village in the desert, what you're going to do is you're going to welcome them and you're going to treat them nicely, you're going to treat them better than the local people. Why? Well, there are many reasons. One of the potential reasons is that life conditions there are very hard. So if you look at a place with very hard life conditions, then is travel about spending money or is travel about survival? So there are different ways that you tend to set these definitions based on when you're looking at these things, where you're looking at these things, what is your final goal. So in all of these definitions, there are things that are implied or assumed that you have to consider. Now, if you look at tourism versus travel in a more historical perspective in the way that they were recorded and used throughout the years, you see a picture that's very different from what the United Nations are telling you. So, for instance, when you look at one of the statements by Eric Cohen, who's a professor of sociology, the sociology of tourism, that's what he researches. What he tells us is, for instance, that the tourist seeks to enjoy the extravagantly strange from the security of the familiar. So, is this something that you believe is true? Are tourists people who are seeking something that is familiar to them, but they want to enjoy the strangeness of other things at the same time? Or are tourists people who want to go there and have an adventure when they go out there? So what is a tourist in the first place? Is there a distinction between the two? The other question here is, well, is that distinction subjective or objective? So if I tell you, well, I am a traveler, and you tell me, well, I'm a tourist. Or rather, if we have, let's give them names. Let's give them names to two people, okay? So we have Peter and John. So Peter likes to think of himself as a traveler. So he goes online, he goes on booking.com, and he books a flight. he books a taxi to take him at the airport, he books a hotel. That's great, okay? And then Peter thinks, well, you know what? I want to get a travel agent who's going to go and book me a taxi, book me a hotel, book me someone to take me at the airport. Well, is there a difference between what they're doing? Is one of them a traveler? Is the other one a tourist? Or are they dependent on the same thing? The fact that you're doing it yourself, does this make you a traveler? Is there a fundamental difference in this? Or is this just a difference of perception, the way that you understand the world? So this is a difficult question. Of course, it doesn't have a straightforward answer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking it in the first place. But this is something that people have thought about for a long time. So the way that the word travel was used in English, especially before the word tourism picked up, was to describe a romanticized idea. So you would go somewhere and you would see things that were wonderful, beautiful, strange. And it was this idea of something that is a unique, a great experience. Now, of course, the other question here is this a perception of you in terms of yourself and traveling? So are you thinking of yourself as this great romantic person, or are other people thinking of yourself as this great romanticized person? And how do you frame yourself, and how do other people think of you when you talk about tourism and traveling? So for instance, when you look at guides like The Lonely Planet, it's always a travel guide. It's never a tourism guide. Why? Is there a difference between the two? So in 19th century literature on travel, there was quite a distinction between the terms. So what people thought was essentially this year that Rowick summarized in this sentence: high culture, the culture of the traveler, saw itself as the polar opposite of low culture, the culture attributed to the tourist. So people that saw themselves as travelers or explorers thought that they were of a higher class, you could call it, or more astute type of people than common or ordinary tourists. So if you look at, for instance, Henry James, the author who has written many books on traveling, he thought of American tourists in Europe as vulgar. But at the same time, you have the opposite perspective, where you have people criticizing him and saying, well, if you are there and you see yourself as something superior to others, then perhaps you are just a tourist that's misunderstanding everything. Perhaps you are someone of the lower classes who's misunderstanding the whole purpose and who cannot allow others to enjoy that experience. So in any case, the fundamental question here is whether there is a difference between travel and tourism to start with, and how does that difference influence the scope of our research, the way that we do research, what kinds of case studies do we focus on, and how do we define our research subjects to start with. So, in any case, however you decide to answer your question, another thing for you to consider is really when and how did tourism become widespread and start, if we assume a distinction between travel and tourism. So for the next part of the talk, what I'll assume is a distinction between travel and tourism. Travel meaning people who are going there on their own, individually exploring, and tourists, people who are going there in an organized manner with a group, with a guide, etc. So how and when did tourism become widespread? Well, to understand the answer to this question, what I think is fundamental for you is to look at history and the historical context of the rise of tourism. So most textbooks, or if you just Google the question or do something like that, would perhaps tell you, well, listen, so you had the developments in technology, and you had Thomas Cook, who organized travel groups in the UK. Well, I think that there is a much deeper cause for the rise of tourism, and it is basically hidden in the characteristics of the time when it rose. So this is why I want to talk to you briefly about modernity. So modernity is a historical period. So it's a period that would that roughly happened in the 17th, the 18th, the 19th century. And what it represents in very simple words is a break from traditional modes of organization. So if you think of it in terms of specific examples, so for instance, religion got replaced with science and rationality. Feudalism got replaced by, well, if it's not democracy, then it's at least some sort of feedback from the citizens to those who govern. Manual labor got replaced by industrial labor. So all of the traditional modes of organization, the modes of organization that we had for a very long time, got replaced within a very short time. And this is what we essentially call modernity. Now, of course, there are a number of theorists that understand that historical periods very, very differently. So some of the classic theorists are here on the board, and I'll go through them very briefly. These are, of course, theories that you can engage with, or you can seek other theories that explain modernity perhaps better or worse. So you have the classic materialistic explanation of Marx. I assume that all of you know that Marx was deeply, well, his theories were deeply embedded in materialism. So what he believed is that the decline of feudalism was a result of change in production relations. So what does a change in production relations mean? Well, with the rise of industrialization, the way that we produce, for instance, products becomes different, and then this increases productivity. So when you increase productivity, this means that the capitalists now want to live a different type of life, the workers now want to live a different type of life. So this resulted in social changes, essentially changes in technology, changed the way that we produce things, increased productivity, and this resulted in profound social changes because people had new demands. So this is a very materialistic explanation of modernity. So this is in contrast to other explanations. So for instance, Max Weber thought that industrial society is possible because of capitalism and rationalization. Now, where does capitalism and rationalization come from then? Well, he believed that this was a result of the Protestant work ethic. So this was a result of the culture that got formed through Protestant religion in Europe. So he believed that this culture was specific to hard work and accumulation of wealth. So accumulation of wealth, of course, as opposition to, for instance, spending your wealth or doing something else with it. So you're accumulating capital for the purpose of gaining more capital in the future. Basically, you're making money to make money. So this is a very cultural explanation of modernity, which is in contrast to the materialistic one. Now, if you look at later theorists, you have, for instance, Jürgen Habermas. So Jürgen Habermas was a critical theorist. And for those of you that don't have a background in social sciences, a quick clarification is that critical theorists are theorists who in some ways believe that the world must be changed. So critical theorists work towards providing ways to change the world in some ways. This is different to mainstream theorists who primarily believe in explaining the world and justifying what it is. So Jürgen Habermas was a critical theorist who believed that modernity was an unfinished project. So this means that it is in motion. In some ways, he believed that it was emancipatory. So in some ways, he believed that it empowered people. For instance, through rationality. If you think rationally, then you become more powerful. In others, he thought that modernity was fundamentally oppressive. So he thought that the combination of the rise of the state, the nation state becoming more powerful, the rise of technology, and the changes in the economy in terms of industrial production were basically colonizing life. So everything that we do in life, in his belief, is in some ways shaped by these three forces. So we're not entirely controlling it, but it's the product rather of external forces that are pressuring us to do specific activities. Now, okay, so the final theorist that we have is Ulrich Beck, who believed that there were two stages of modernity. The first one was a transition from agrarian to industrial society. So this is finished, this is done. And the second one is reflexive modernization. So in essence, what this means is that modernity gave us the ability to reflect on ourselves, reflect on the structures around us, and this gave us the power to begin changing them or transforming them in certain ways. Now, what he argues is that this leads to a certain type of what he calls risk society. So this means that we are all constantly in a society which gives us more risk because the structures within it might change. So for instance, before we had norms coming from the church and we had to comply with them because we believed they come from God. Now we are able to change these structures, we're able to question these norms, and this is why we're under risk of going through greater changes. We can question institutions like the family. We can choose to live an individualistic life. So this gives our society a greater amount of risk. Now, I want to go very briefly back to Giddens, because modernity had certain consequences that had to do with time and space. And you might be wondering at this point, what does that have to do with tourism at all? Well, if you think about tourism and if you think about travel, well, what is this except for movement within time and space? Tourism and travel is movement within time and space. So if the way that we perceive time and space changes, then naturally this of course has implications for tourism and travel. So he believed, well, Giddens believed that there were three major consequences of modernity. And the first one was that we began to redefine time and space. And I've just put here a couple of examples. So for instance, the standardization of things, or the so-called globalization, which is of course a very blurry concept. Sped up communication. So if we have standards that we have agreed on, then we can of course proceed more quickly, whether we're talking about transactions or about negotiations or about travel. The second way in which time and space started to get redefined in Giddens's argument was through technological devices. So for instance, if you think about something simple, like a Kindle reader, like an e-book reader, this device might hold 100 books, 1,000 books. Now this replaces a bookshelf. So before you needed the space for an entire bookshelf, now you need the space for one small device. If you think about the computer, how many gadgets did you need before to do the tasks that one computer can do? You needed a typewriter, you needed a separate screen like a TV screen or something. So basically gadgets expand our time and space very, very rapidly. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, when you think of young people and the way that they're attracted to gadgets, this is potentially one of the reasons that young people are so much fascinated with gadgets, and even children. You know, when they take them, because it opens a whole new world. You don't have to go anywhere. You can just click on it and it opens a whole number of possibilities. So time and space got redefined. And then what we also had was the disembedding of social systems. So before, what we needed was certain social systems to function. So in our city or in our country, or whatever the structure that you're living in might be, you have a certain way of exchanging value. So it might be money, it might be a gift economy if you're from a small society. Either way, you have a certain way that's specific to your society. Now, once you had the spread of money and the spread of currency exchange across the whole world, well, what that meant is that this produces new patterns across time and space. So if you imagine the map and how things flow, there were fundamentally new patterns that got produced by that. So how would you travel if you can't exchange your currency? Again, that leads back to the way that tourism got shaped to start with. The other thing that is fascinating about social systems was that you had a trend of the removal of social relations. So before, in a smaller society, if you wanted to see the doctor or if you wanted to see a lawyer, normally you also had some sort of a personal relationship with them, in the sense that they were probably your friend or your neighbor or somebody that you knew at least about. Well, now we have what Giddens calls expert systems. So in every city, in every structure, Even here in university, we have an expert system. So you don't need to have personal relations close to people anymore. You can just move somewhere. And that also, of course, relates to time and space. And you will also have access to experts. Now, this, of course, is based on a notion of trust. So even the fact that you're here right now and you're trusting me is also a part of the consequence of these expert systems. So the third consequence of modernity was reflexivity, which we spoke briefly about before. So any form of social practice is now under question, and we are able to examine them and provide feedback and then reform them. So everything becomes open to reflection. Now, what is the problem or the paradox here? Well, reflection itself is also subject to reflection. So the fact that I am questioning the structure, is this beneficial itself to me or to society, or is this something that I should do? So am I benefiting things or people in that way, or am I not? Anyway, so this was something that has clearly started to happen, at least to some extent, because you see people questioning reflection, questioning what is happiness, questioning what is the meaning of life, etc. So that was the context in which tourism emerged. So when you look at these things, and I'll just go back briefly to the previous slide, travel and tourism could never exist without these things. So if you don't have industrial production, you would never be able to go and have travel and tourism at that scale, because we have this enormous availability of goods and services that solved a lot of our basic problems, and this is why we could afford to travel. And this is, all of it is a consequence of modernity. If you don't have capitalism, you wouldn't have a lot of the incentives that people have to grow the tourism industry and to build tourism. So before capitalism, where would the motivation for tourism come from to start with, to build an industry out of it? Of course, if you think about other concepts like the nation state, we're going to talk about them in a minute, all of them are things that just framed the emergence of tourism to start with. And obviously, time and space also framed the way that we perceive the world around us in general. So, technically, if you look at the timeline of the emergence of mass tourism, or, well, not mass tourism at this stage, but organized tourism rather, it was the result of, well, in one sentence, technology and capitalism. So in the early days of organized travel, what you needed is the means to go to a particularly faraway place. So back in the day, at the beginning of organized travel in England, this was usually the steamboat, and later, of course, it became the railway. So air transport, of course, didn't develop until much later. And during these days, scholars call them the mobility era. Now, there are different ways that you can split this period. Some of them think of a new mobility era, that was the second half of this period, etc. But that's really the era where people started moving on a much greater scale. So the first known travel agency started very early, but if you look at who they served, well, they served the British Royal Armed Forces. So they were not really an agency that served regular, ordinary people from the masses. And then the first person that gets tremendous credit in all textbooks and research papers is Thomas Cook, who created the first leisure travel agency, Thomas Cook and Son. So what he did was he pioneered modern organized travel. So he thought about things like cost-effective tickets, saving money on transport. He printed guides for travel. So Thomas Cook is really the guy who created organized travel in its modern form. And he offered package tours to the Far East, to India, and to America. Of course, he used steamships for them. And by 1897, by this point, Thomas Cook was dead. He died in 1892, if I remember correctly. But his agency, Thomas Cook and Son, was serving 20,000 tourists annually, which for back then was, of course, a great number of people, given that it was an industry that just started to emerge. The latter period of the mobility era is usually also referred to as the post-Cook period. Why? Well, because people started following the model that Thomas Cook provided for them. So, this entire era was really the early period of organized travel. So it was picking up, but it was more in terms of shaping the ways that agents operate. It was not about taking it to a huge scale yet. So it was more about forming the industry, not about considering scale. And then from the 1950s to the 1980s, what you had is this tremendous boom of mass tourism, at least in Europe and the US. Now, of course, that's different for different parts of the world. As we saw, China didn't even start using tourism as a word in general until the Reform and Opening. So if you think about time and space here, again, it's a key factor that explains when and where tourism emerged. Now, why did mass tourism start to boom in Europe from the 50s to the 80s? Well, first of all, there was a greater prosperity of the population at large. So if you think about the way that the global capitalist economy works, well, what we've seen, at least in the past 100 years or so, is that capitalism creates greater wealth on average for people. So we've reduced a lot of the poverty that we have. Now, of course, there have been also negative impacts of that, like greater inequalities between people. But in either case, you still have greater prosperity of the population at large. So they had more to spend on tourism, especially at the beginning of the post-war period. If you talk to a lot of the tutors here, for example, that are much older than me, they would tell you that it was much easier to buy a house or to do a lot of other things in the UK during the 50s and the 60s. So back then you had a number of other phenomena also that combined with that. You started having paid or salaried holidays for many European workers. So you had the strong influence of trade unions that pressured the state to give people holidays and time off. You also had a lot of excess airplanes. So after the war, what are you going to do with all of the airplanes that you produced? You have to do something with them. And of course, you had research going into technical improvements of aircraft production. Now, commercial flights, in fact, started much earlier. They started in 1914, but so there were a number of problems with them. So the first one was that back then you couldn't really do transatlantic flights, so you couldn't go over the ocean on an airplane. The other one was that you didn't really have these huge, massive aircraft. So if you look at the Boeings that we go on today that can carry 400 or so people, these were not the types of airplanes that people had in 1914. They were much smaller, and they could not operate as efficiently in many ways. They were also not as comfortable. So there was also the factor of comfort when you're trying to sell something that's for leisure. You also had a greater sense of, well, technically democracy now, I've used the word democracy in general here. Of course, democracy is very contentious at that period. Democracy is also what got Hitler elected, technically. So, it's not necessarily a greater sense of one person, one vote, but it's a greater sense of freedom and equality. One of the reasons is because, well, if you go and fight a war with somebody, then you clearly get a sense of great equality with them, because both of you are at the same risk, the risk of getting shot, essentially. So war creates a lot of equality between people that come from different classes, but then fight at the same risk or for the same purpose. Another factor was better education. This was the period in world history, at least until then, that registered the highest increase in students enrolled in universities. So this was when people started to go to university for the first time ever, really on a mass level. That was the 50s, 60s, 70s, at least in Europe and the US. Again, this trend has of course come later now to many other places in the world. The other factor is better packaging that the tour operators started to offer. So the industry really developed and learned from the past 50 or so years. So in the interwar period, for example, you had issues with a shortage of accommodation supply. So you had much greater demand for accommodation than supply at some point. And obviously the industry learned and they built more hotels so they could offer, they could satisfy the demand. And also, you know, capitalists learned how to package it better, more efficiently, and at a greater value for the people. At the same time, you had the start of media and television. So you started having these images of foreign places getting spread around on a mass scale, and people seeing them in their living room. So all of these factors all together led to what was really an increase for the first time in history of mass tourism in Europe and the US. Now, when you look at a framework like this, this is not just something that you can take as an empirical description. Now, you can take this and you can think about other places or other countries. Is there a country somewhere else in the world at the moment which has greater prosperity at large, which has paid holidays for the first time, which has a greater sense of freedom, which has better education? Which is this country? Which are these countries? And is there a rise in mass tourism there as well? So these empirical descriptions are not simply a story about history that we're just telling to amuse ourselves. We can use them to actually analyze the world and understand what other places are going through similar phenomena. Are they producing more tourists or aren't they, and why so? So take these frameworks and use them also as a way of analyzing the world. Now, there were two forces that were tremendously powerful in the last 200 years. In my opinion, they really shaped a whole lot of what we see today in the world. And these two forces were, number one, the nation state. The state in general, the country, the sense of belonging to this particular group of people and territory. And the second one was the development of capitalism, because it really created an idea of an ultimate quantifier in the way that we tend to use money when you spread it on a global scale. So tourism became clearly very much related to these two trends. So the nation state and tourism have a very interesting relationship. So first of all, when you think about globalization and territorialism, these are two concepts that are embedded in the way that tourism developed. So first of all, there are people that argue that, well, if we have more tourism, the world becomes more globalized. Why? Because we can see new places, we get engaged with new groups of people, etc. On the other hand, let's flip it and think, well, what does traveling internationally mean? Where are you going? Well, you're going to a different country. Great. Well, if we didn't have set borders, how would you go to a different country? So really, the reason why we can do international travel is because we have these set boundaries between countries. So if you get rid of the boundaries, well, there goes international tourism. So are we globalizing, or are we becoming more territorial? And we know this is my territory, this is my place that you visit, and this is your place that I visit. What does tourism mean? Does it mean that we're becoming more of a one entire cooperative world, or does it mean that we are emphasizing distinctions between you and me, between self and other? In any case, whatever you believe on that question, there were a great number of phenomena that were related directly to the nation state and tourism. So first of all, tourism from a foreign country is a source of foreign currency. So today, that might seem to some of you like something that's not that important. Believe me, if you look at it 50 years ago, 60 years ago in the Soviet Union, for example, the way that foreign tourists were treated was always very good. The prices for foreign tourists were always higher. They wanted to get all of these US dollars because the economy at large did not have enough US dollars to deal in international trade. So tourism is a source of a foreign currency. If you look in the 80s, the way that tourism began to develop in China, there were hardly any people that were traveling internationally during the 80s in China, but they had massive campaigns for getting people from the outside into China. Why? Well, they're a source of foreign currency. For any economy that is trying to emerge, that is trying to begin engaging internationally, they really want foreign currency, and specifically, of course, they're primarily interested in the big currencies, the euro, the dollar, the yen, the Japanese yen, the pound, the British pound, and perhaps in the future, the Chinese yuan. We're yet to see whether that's gonna materialize. Anyway, so tourism is something that is essential to the collection of foreign currency, and if you look at other places like the way that North Korea operates tourism today, they are very welcoming to tourists. Why? Well, there you go. That is the answer for you, foreign currency. One of the answers, at least. So the other issue with the nation state in tourism is visa requirements. So the state is essentially a gatekeeper to who comes in, who comes out. And when you look at things like foreign currency and visa requirements, what you start to see here is something that is somewhat of an imbalanced relationship of status in international politics. So if you have a passport from an OECD country, which means one of the most developed countries, then you happen to be welcome in many places. If you have a passport from countries that are, well, usually totalitarian in terms of their political regime, you have a very hard time getting a visa for other places. Why so, and how so? How come the American is welcome in many countries in the Middle East, but people from the Middle East are not welcome in the US? For tourism, I mean. I'm not even talking about immigration or anything like that. Anyway, so think about how this essentially relates altogether, and whether there is a certain sort of class of states. What is a higher class state? What is a lower class state, if any at all? And how does travel and tourism show this to us? The other issue here is, of course, nationalism and tourism. So if you have more people traveling, does this mean that you're increasing the level of nationalism or decreasing the level of nationalism? And well, some of you might think that it's obvious, well, for various reasons. So, you might think that when you go abroad, you see different things and that makes you more cosmopolitan. Well, if you flip it and you think about, even when you think about yourselves, so international students, when they come to the UK, who do they make friends with first? Is it local people or people from the home countries? Right. So the moment you arrive in a different place, you start very quickly to identify very strongly with the place that you came from by seeing the differences between your place of origin and your destination. So are you becoming more globalist or more nationalist? I don't know the answer. Well, I can tell you empirically that from working in China, I've seen so many Chinese students come back and they come back much more nationalist-minded than when they left. So when they left, many of them believed that they would go and discover something that would be fundamentally and radically transformative. And instead, what happens to many of them is, well, they discover something that they don't like that much in comparison to what they had. So they come back much more nationalist. And then you have the opposite case. You have so many, you have students and also people that go and work abroad that go somewhere and never come back. They discover a whole new world. So they do become globalist. So what does this mean, travel and tourism, in this situation? Do you become globalist or do you become more nationalist? The other issue is national heritage sites. So first of all, the idea of national heritage to start with has to do with the nation state. So are these things that you're proud of? Why are you proud of them? This is something located 1,000 kilometers away from where you are, or at least 100. So how come you're proud of it? How come this is a part of your identity? For what reason? Who said so? And this is also something that's worth thinking about. Are these heritage sites for foreigners that can come and look at the greatness of our country, or are they for ourselves so we can send our children to see them and to grow up believing that they are a part of this nation? So why do we promote tourism at national heritage sites for foreigners or for our own people? All of these issues really relate to the discrepancies between domestic and international tourism. So when you think about domestic tourism, for instance, there are very different trends, especially when it comes to large countries, to great powers. So if you think of the US, I think statistically there are about 36% of Americans that have a foreign passport. This means that the rest of Americans have likely never been abroad because they just travel within their own country. If you look at what's more shocking is China, actually, because China has statistically something about 7%, or it might have gone up. That was 1 or 2 years ago. There were only 7% of Chinese people that have traveled abroad from the whole country. So that means 93% of people have spent their entire lives within China. Well, if they travel, where do they travel? They travel domestically. Well, if they travel domestically, where do they go? To national heritage sites. Well, if they go to national heritage sites, how does this relate to the nation state? How does that influence their thinking? And it's all, again, it's not the US or it's not China, it's all large countries. If you look at Russia, Russia has a population of about 144 million people, I think, at the moment. And there are only 18 million Russian people that have been abroad, I think, in the past year or so. That means there is, what percentage is that? About 15%, 18 million out of 140 of people who are traveling abroad. Well, where are the rest of them traveling? What are they seeing? And why are they traveling really? And who's promoting that type of traveling? Anyways, so the nation state and tourism are closely interrelated, whether you're talking about international tourism or whether you're talking about domestic tourism. Now, if you look at the way that tourist arrivals are spread around the world, there is also a number of other interesting phenomena. So in total, for the past year, I think it was for 2018 or these numbers, there were 1.4 billion international, well, they say international tourists, but what they actually measure is international travelers. So these statistics are fundamentally, well, I believe, at least, you might argue with me, but I believe that they're fundamentally flawed because they calculate anybody who went there and stopped for a night as a tourist. That is clearly not necessarily the case. They might be visiting family, they might be on a business trip, or they might be doing something else there. Anyways, so if you look at the ways that these arrivals are spread, this is also fascinating. So the tremendous majority of tourists internationally are going to Europe. And there are very, very small numbers for places like Africa and the Middle East in comparison. Now, economically, this has tremendous consequences. First of all, because of the numbers of tourists. Second of all, because of prices and expenditure. How much does a tourist spend in Europe? How much does a tourist spend in Africa? Yeah. So there is difference in prices, the prices of accommodation, the prices of goods, the prices of food. So these numbers are really beyond fascinating, There is really a large chunk of the tourism industry is really Europe only. And then you also have, the Americas and Asia, and the rest of the world is really not in the equation. And also, it doesn't even work out in terms of population. Asia has a population that is many times larger than that of Europe, So there are great imbalances economically that arise out of that. Capitalism has shaped tourism to start with. So on one hand, you have a lot of private companies that are interested in growth. Why? Because tourism is an industry. An industry means you have businesses. Businesses are interested in profit. Now, on the other side of the coin, what you have is the nation state. So you have national economies. And if you follow the news every year, there are predicted numbers of growth for each national economy. So for instance, this year we expect the US to grow by 2.1%. We expect China to grow by 6.3%. Well, where does this growth come from? So you need certain ways to grow the economy, and both capitalists and the nation state are interested in expanding industries. Well, tourism is an industry. Great, let's make people travel. So, why are we traveling really? Are we traveling because we chose to, or are we traveling because there are much greater forces at play? This is, of course, again, a hard question. Now, the problem with growth is fundamental, especially if any of you have thought of the economy critically. Well, you have a number of fundamental contradictions in capitalism, starting with the ones that Marx pointed out in his early works. So some of the fundamental contradictions, for instance, are, well, if I am a capitalist, my goal is to make profit. So I want to make more money for myself and pay the workers less. Well, this is great. But again, let's assume that I am Peter and I have a factory for monitors, and I am John and I have a factory for computers. Well, Peter wants to make a lot of money and pay the workers very little money. John wants to do the same. Well, these workers are going to be the same consumers that want to go and buy things tomorrow. So who is going to buy Peter's monitors and John's computers if they didn't pay the workers what they produced? So this is a fundamental contradiction in capitalism, for instance. Now, of course, this can get solved in many ways in terms of international markets, international trade, outsourcing, anyways. But the point is that there are contradictions of growth in capitalism, because all of these ways of solving the problem of growth have to do with expansion. Capitalism is by nature, by definition, an expansive phenomenon. So what happens when we can't really expand towards the outside world anymore? Because, well, after the end of colonization, it became clear that we can't just go and expand. Well, we discovered the whole planet Earth. There's nowhere to expand. So one way to solve this is tourism. Because there are, again, when we think about tourism, think about time and space. There are fundamental ways in which tourism uncovers time and space. So let's say you're on a holiday, okay? You go, I don't know, on a short boat ride, okay? It takes 1 hour. You pay somebody, I don't know, $50. They take you around for an hour. So this boat can go today, I don't know, 10 times, 15 times in a circle, okay? So it's the same amount of space that we're occupying here, but we're expanding growth. So we're expanding the amount of growth within limited space. How? By offering things like services. Now, services obviously feed into tourism. So when we can't sell any more products, we sell experiences, we sell services. And this is why when you look at the composition of the global economy, you find things like agriculture occupying 4%, and you find things like manufacturing occupying, I believe, 16% or 10%, I'm not sure. But anyways, so you find these material products occupying a very small proportion of things, and what you find is services and things like financial services, for God's sake, occupying a majority of growth. I mean, how is the banker providing growth? What is he growing? Money. Well, more or less. But, and so tourism is one of the ways to promote growth within a limited space. So perhaps this might be one of the solutions to the problems of capitalism in many ways. But that's, again, something for you to think about. Well, tourism, if you look at the statistics, contributes to a little bit over 10% of global GDP. So that means 1 out of every $10 or pounds or whatever on average really comes from tourism. If you look at the jobs, well, tourism contributes 1 out of 10 jobs. So out of every 10 people, 1 of them make a living because they're in the tourism industry. So also this trend is on the increase. So if you look at job creation, tourism is creating a lot more jobs. So it is really fundamental to the way that economies are reshaping in the current era. Now, obviously, we've encountered the problem of expansion and the problem of time and space. and the problem of desire for profit. Well, what does that lead to? For those of you working on sustainability, well, here is where the problem comes from, really. Because we're trying to expand something very rapidly, very fast, within a limited amount of space and time. So this is the fundamental source of the sustainability problem. And it really, well, again, some of you might argue with me for being too cynical, but it fundamentally comes from human greed. What's the problem of sustainability? The problem is that you want to have more and you want to have it constantly. So, it's really a problem that we've created ourselves. Well, primarily through our own greed. Well, sustainability is a concept that first got created in the 70s and then got popular during the 80s, and unsurprisingly, a few years after sustainability became popular, well, somebody coined the concept sustainable tourism. Now, the concept of sustainable tourism didn't really become popular until the early 90s. So, when you think of it in terms of the time scale of how and when sustainable tourism came about, flipping back a few slides, as you might remember, mass tourism developed between the 50s and the 80s. This was the golden age of mass tourism. And sustainability, when was it created again? Right, in the 80s, yeah. In 84, right. So when and where did the sustainability problem come from? Well, this is where it came from. So this is why we were talking about this topic in the first place. Why did we have an academic journal on this topic being created? Well, surprise, surprise, because we've been creating that problem for 40 years. So when you think about the ways that people attempted to explain and identify sustainable tourism, you run into a whole lot of issues. Well, first of all, it doesn't seem like anybody really knows what sustainable tourism is. So if you look at the definitions, one of the main scholars, Weaver, believes that, for instance, the main difference between the old and the new form of tourism is moving the focus of well-being of the tourist to the well-being of the host community. Well, now some people looking at this type of statement immediately respond as, well, this is intellectually arrogant, it's expensive, it's elitist, and it's useless. So, what you're telling us is really because you're perceiving yourself as somehow better than the world. Oh, surprise, surprise, here's how the world works, we're greedy, okay? So you're being elitist in your statement. Now, of course, these are extreme statements on each side, but think about what are the responses and how can we actually make them, reconcile the differences between them. Now, if you look at other definitions of the concept, the development of tourism must provide benefits to all partners / stakeholders, provided they do not adversely affect resources available for future generations. Well, I mean, first of all, this is a very broad definition. So you can say this statement about pretty much everything. Well, we don't really want to destroy it. Well, the first question is, well, how do you really apply this when you have a broad definition? You can't potentially define anything to apply. Well, the second problem is this really what you want? Is this really the purpose of it, not destroying things? Or is destroying things something that will allow us space to create new things? So, well, of course, in nature, there is a very clear argument that we don't want to destroy things, but when it's things that are human-made, you have, of course, concepts like creative destruction by Schumpeter, who believe that, of course, for business, what you have to do is, well, you have to destroy the old product to create a new one. And if you think, actually, about the way that the world around you works, how many of you have an Apple computer or iPhone or something like that? Yeah, a few of you, right. So, remember what was the first popular Apple product in the 2000s? How did you listen to music?
iPod.
Right, you had the iPod. Well, who killed the iPod? What came after the iPod?
iPhone.
Right, the iPhone, of course. So who killed Apple killed Apple, right? So it was a process of creative destruction. So you destroy something that was created by yourself to create something else. So if we have a really old house or whatever it is that's built by people generations ago, do we want to keep it forever or do we want to move on? This is a philosophical question. But again, the answers are not as simple. You know, you have, especially if you look at the expansion and the way that cities are designed, you see all of these old houses. Even where I live in Beijing, you have the hutongs which are basically small alleys in the center that are these, well, very low one floor, well, buildings with shared bathrooms. Well, I mean, is this something that you would like to keep, or is this something that you would like to destroy? Now, I don't know the answer, obviously, and I find them tremendously beautiful, but this is my own opinion. And again, you can see the argument very clearly that you want to get rid of them and you want to move on. So when it comes to destroying things, what is really what is the thing that we should do in each situation is very unclear. Well, if you look at other points on sustainable tourism, all forms of tourism that are compatible with and contribute to sustainable development. Well, first of all, what is sustainable development? How do you define it? How do you contribute to it? To what extent do you contribute to it? You know, I may contribute to it a little bit, but not enough. How do you know how much is enough? It's a very blurry concept, sustainable tourism. So this is an issue for you to resolve in your research, in your project. So you have to actually grapple with this issue of what is sustainable tourism to begin with, and what is a definition of the concept that is specific enough for you to use. So when you look at recommendations from the big scholars like Weaver that tell us how we should do sustainable tourism, well, you find a whole huge number of contradictions between market demands and supply, between economic interests. Well, if you look at, of course, most shockingly in the economics category, well, mass unsustainable tourism means high earnings. Sustainable tourism means low earnings. So, you know, how do you grapple with that difference? If you look at lodging, well, mass tourism means large scale lodging, and sustainable tourism means low scale lodging. Well, what if I have demand for 50,000, 100,000 new tourists a year, and I am a capitalist or I'm a politician? Should I build a big hotel and move on and take their money, or should I promote sustainable tourism and not offer them enough space and they're not going to come here? At least not all of them. I mean, if you look at it from a practical perspective, really a lot of these suggestions are basically contradictions. All of them are clashes of interests between groups. And how does that get resolved is a very complex question. So essentially, so far this section demonstrated to you that modernity is what really shaped tourism. So things like the way that we redefine time and space, industrial production, etc. And what it also showed you in relevance to your projects on sustainable tourism, for those of you who are working on that topic, is, well, this is a huge clash of interests between capitalists, the nation state, locals, etc., that have really come as a product of the history that shaped tourism. So they're not a simple clash. I want A, you want B. They have a historical, long background. Well, so what happens after tourism, after sustainable tourism, after the 80s and the 90s? What is happening today? So in the tourism industry, what you see, and perhaps all of you have used these things and you're a product of these given your age, is somewhat of a return from tourism to travel, at least in some markets. Now, before I talk about this section, keep in mind that there are very different markets here. So if you're looking at the UK, where the golden age of mass tourism was between the 50s and the 80s, now we are in an era after the golden age of mass tourism. If you're looking at the emerging market of China, where mass tourism recently started. Well, perhaps because industrialization started much later. We are, well, perhaps at the beginning or in the middle of emerging mass tourism. So when I talk about this trend from tourism to travel, this is for markets that went already through a period of mass tourism. This is not for markets that are emerging. And the other question is, well, is this trend going to be applicable 10 years from now, 20 years from now to markets that emerged later? Or is it not? Because again, this is not very certain. Now, what is that trend? Well, all of you have probably looked at online travel writing, people writing blogs, sharing their experience firsthand. You can just, click on a button, share it with the world. There is tremendous information availability compared to before. And, well, this enables you to actually know where you're going, know where you want to go. This is another thing. When you look at mass tourists, I always wonder, actually, when I look at a group of tourists, do these people know exactly where they're going and why they're going there? I don't know the answer, I wonder, it looks to me like they're mostly just looking at things, but then again, I'm not in their head, so who knows? But individual tourists, on the other hand, they usually have an idea of where they're going. They've bought their little guide or whatever they perceive as, an element of the traveler. And at least they know where they're going and what they're doing, so there's great information availability. There is digital bookings. Now, digital bookings, there is another question here. Has this fundamentally changed the idea of tour operators, or did this just change the way that we book our holidays through, well, not operators perhaps, but at least corporate actors? So another point here is the sharing economy. So things like Airbnb, person-to-person accommodation. Now, these are things that change the traditional hotel model. There is personalization of service. So people who are going there because they know where they're going and why they're there. They want to see specific things. They want to do specific things. They want personalized, tailored service. Now, out of this, you have, of course, things like the digital nomad culture. So this is something that you might have possibly heard of, but in places like, for instance, Bali in Indonesia, you have a whole group of foreigners. And when I say foreigners, primarily, I mean Western people who come from societies where mass tourism is already a trend of the past. Well, organized mass tourism. Sorry, mass tourism is still here, but not organized. So these people have essentially moved there with their laptops and they're working remotely. So they are what they call themselves the digital nomads. So we are seeing something that resembles, at least to me, the return of travel and the decline of tourism. So basically, what we are wondering about here is whether in societies that have gone past the point of modernity, there is a regular trend from travel to, from tourism to travel, and whether there is a revival in travel in a way that is similar to the original concept of the literature of the 19th century of an explorer. Well, so to understand how that proposition would work, well, first of all, we'd have to understand what comes after modernity. So, unsurprisingly, after modernity, what contemporary sociologists tell us is that we have the concept of post-modernity. So this would, in theory, be the world that we are living in today. So, if you think about for a second about the way that Giddens, the famous sociologist, thought about modernity back in the day, well, he believed that the world is open to transformation by human intervention. So when we stop believing in God or any form of superior power, you believe that you can transform the world as opposed to a greater power. And that reflexivity is key. Well, if reflexivity is key, then there is a potential proposition for modernity to be modernizing itself. So how is modernity transforming itself and what comes after that. Well, if you look back at Ulrich Beck's theory of a risk society, what you find is an argument that we are potentially all facing common threats. And because of that, we have started to disregard distinctions of class that were fundamental to the past. So for instance, if all of us are facing climate change, then it wouldn't matter if I am richer or poorer than you, because all of us are in a bad situation. Now, this theory has, of course, some merit, but then on the other end, you can think about climate change and even things like what some of you are working on in terms of water conflict, and whether this is actually affecting all people, or is this affecting some people? Is this affecting people at the poorer end of the economic structure? So is this a risk society for everybody, and what kind of risk is it that we are facing? So one proposition is that we have a second stage of modernity. So if you ask Beck, he would tell you we have modernity 2.0. Well, another proposition is that you have post-modernity. So in a post-modern world, what you have is people leading supposedly fragmentary lives. So instead of identifying themselves by their social class, they tend to identify themselves and be identified by their ethnicity or their age or their gender. Now, the other phenomenon that we have here is a trend. So from media to the idea of post-truth. So if you look at contemporary debates in terms of media, and even the way that media is developing, mainstream media outlets are really struggling to stay alive in general, because there are many people who are doubting what is said on mainstream media. And this also is one of the phenomena that brought around the election of Trump to start with. So you had the idea of post-truth era. What is true? How do we know what is true? And who provides us with the truth? So once you start questioning everything and reflecting on the world, then you start questioning your sources of information. Now, another consequence of this was, well, that we couldn't really tell anymore the difference between reality and fiction. And what I mean by this in practical terms would be something like the election, for instance, of the Ukrainian Prime Minister Zelensky. If you follow politics, you will know that Ukraine got a new prime minister elected earlier this year. So the person who got elected is an actor. He's not a politician. What happened was they had the same person in power for a number of years, and then Zelensky is the actor who displaced him. Zelensky is the star of a TV show, and the TV show that he stars in is one where an ordinary school teacher gets elected by accident as the president. So this was shown as a TV show, on in the evenings on Ukrainian TV. And what happened was, at some point, he decided to actually run for elections. And well, surprise, surprise, he got elected. And I think 1 or 2 weeks ago, he also won the parliamentary elections. So this means his party now has a good majority in parliament to pass laws. So what is the borderline between reality and fiction? If you're playing the president on a TV show, are you actually the president? Or do people believe that you're the president? What is being the president? What does it mean? Am I a lecturer? Really? Why am I a lecturer? And how so? So this is a trait of postmodernity, where you tend to question everything. And as you can see with the election of Zelensky, for instance, this became very, very real. So another characteristic of postmodernism is the way that people choose to live their lives. So they started having portfolio jobs. So very few people today want, well, at least in Western urbanized places, want to work only one job. They want to have a number of jobs. They want to have weekend small jobs that make them additional money. They want to be able to choose the time when they travel, the time when they take holidays. They don't want to be bound to one particular company or one particular job or one particular lifestyle. You see the breakdown of local communities. So once you start questioning reality and you start questioning, well, everything really, then why would you belong to a local community where you happen to be more or less by accident? Or for one specific reason that doesn't have to do with the people there. What you see is a lot of ephemeral trends, so short-term trends in fashion, in music, overnight. Something is fashionable today, not fashionable tomorrow. There is no ultimate criteria for taste or for what is in good taste or in bad taste or fashionable or not fashionable. These things tend to change very quickly. Well, why? Possibly, if you believe that theory, because we live in a postmodern society where we tend to question things constantly. Well, in a modernist society, people used to be, defined in many ways through, again, their rationality and their science, but in a postmodernist society, what Bauman at least claims is that people are defined through products and experiences. So that's actually a very interesting phenomenon, and it also strikes me when I look at, well, first of all, when I look at students' technology. So that I find fascinating. In many ways, I feel like students just identify themselves with the objects around them in the way that they choose, for instance, to be loyal Apple customers. So they become what they believe is an Apple user. It's like you see this image and then you tend to fall for it and then you try to become this image. And then also by experiences. So if you look at people's social media, the way that they project themselves to the outside world, it doesn't seem to be anymore a projection that says, well, look, I am a person who, well, I don't know, who is hardworking or honest or something like that. Well, I am a person who is on holiday on the Bahamas, and this is what defines me. This is the way that I present myself to the world. So, it looks like there is some sort of a trend for people to project themselves in terms of objects or in terms of experiences when they present themselves to the world, which is, in a way, fascinating. And also you have the idea of cultural, of a cultural hybrid going on. So, well, if you don't believe that anything is kind of pure to start with, then every form of culture, whether it's national culture, whether it's a micro culture of university students or whatever it might be, is basically a mixture of many different factors that got put together. Well, that is clearly empirically true. If you look at it, it is fairly obvious to me. But the problem is that when you start believing this, then you can easily start to question any form of culture that gets formed by saying, well, look, if it got formed in this particular way, then why shouldn't it change? Why shouldn't we mix it with something else? Why shouldn't we change all of the norms around us? So clearly this has, again, a tight relation to the way that time and space is perceived. So if you question reality, then how do you perceive time and space when you don't know what is actually real? Well, in that sense, authenticity is something that is actually related to the idea of postmodernity and the idea of, well, what some scholars have claimed is post-tourists. So if you had mass tourists during modernity, then in post-modernity you have post-tourists. Now, is this a thing or no is, again, a question for you to decide. But there is certainly a number of authors who are claiming that this is a certain group of people that is familiar with technology and responsive to media, and they have become fundamentally different to the traditional tourist. Now, post-tourists, they tend to, in terms of research findings, people have found that they tend to gain what they perceive as authentic experiences away from mass tourist sites. So one of the criteria for a post-tourist to think that they're doing something authentic is not to be with the masses. Now, does this make it authentic or does this not make it authentic? Well, this is a question for you to think about. They want to see and represent themselves as different from mass tourists. Well, here is another issue that kind of reminds me of the idea of class being brought back, because what postmodernity was supposed to do was, well, get rid of the class debate. We're not going to talk about the elites and the masses anymore. We're going to talk about, well, you know, I am a man, I am a white man, you know, I am a white man in his late 20s, you know, and I'm going to identify myself in this way through personal traits. Well, sure, but then post-tourists, as a group, they tend to think of themselves as something more than mass tourists. So in that way, they're creating another idea of class, which doesn't have to do with money necessarily, but with the way that they understand and perceive the world and interact with it. So this is a form of elitism that is emerging among post-tourists. Well, again, when you do not always make a distinction between reality and fiction, do you really believe that there is, well, true culture? So when you start to question reality, you start to accept anything that resembles culture as culture because you don't believe that there is an authentic concept to start with. So things like hyper-realities, things like Disneyland, things like completely constructed new realities become something that the postmodern person tends to embrace. And this is not just a phenomenon that, you know, you can go and look at and say, well, yes, sure, they built a whole new world. Well, this is a phenomenon that says, well, the people that actually embrace it as something real are people who potentially question reality. So, you know, are they there because they know it's unreal and they like the idea that it's unreal? Or are they there because they believe it's real? Or are they there because they believe nothing is real? And this is just a part of everything else. So, on other traits of well, so-called post-tourists are things like escapism. So are these people that are deeply unsatisfied with contemporary society, deeply unsatisfied with the structures that they are part of, with 9-to-5 jobs, with families. Why do you have to have a family? You know, I am myself, I'm an individual. I can go and escape because I am a postmodern person. I have discovered that nothing is real. This means I have no responsibility. Well, here is a problem. If you believe that you have no responsibility, then how do you have meaning in life? Because if you don't believe you're not responsible for anything, then you don't achieve anything. Why? Because you have no criteria for achieving anything. Well, if you don't achieve anything ever, then how are you going to feel satisfied? Whatever it is you might achieve, whether it's a good grade or buying a house or whatever you might think of. So it's a fundamental problem that people are facing. Also, there is the idea of chasing the experience, chasing the entertainment, chasing the fun. Why? Well, you know, again, if you don't have a fundamental grounding in believing that something is real, then why wouldn't you chase the fun? Well, and then if postmodern tourists are indeed correct, then all of us are potentially wasting our time being in institutions and structures. Maybe they are really, you know, getting the essence of life, and we have been wasting our lives for ages. Or maybe they have been wasting their lives for ages, and we're finding meaning. I don't know. In any case, there is also the concept of serious leisure. Now, leisure is also something very interesting. Leisure as a concept in society, it started with well, of course, it's always been associated with the elites, but at the mass level, it started with the rising middle class, again, after industrialization. So there are many societies, for instance, I spent a certain amount of time in India fairly recently, and there were many people from the older generation that didn't necessarily have a concept of leisure. So on Saturday morning, they would get up and go to the office, and they would be very happy about it because they thought that this was their purpose in life. You know, they were happy to go to the office. This was their own company. They created it 30 years ago. It's like that's their baby. They want to be there on Saturday morning. They don't want to go and play golf. They don't care about golf. What is golf? You know, it's just, you know, you're just hitting a ball with a stick. It's like, why would I do that when I can go and find meaning in my office? So, you know, these are things that have started to change. And they change, of course, with the change of economic conditions and leisure at the mass level comes with the rising middle class. Now, in societies where leisure is widespread, like Western contemporary societies, you have the concept of serious leisure when you talk about tourism. So what does that mean? Well, if you have a hobby, well, this is something that you might do occasionally. For leisure, you might do it on the weekend. And for tourism, you might go and do it for a week. So, for instance, if I like wines, then, you know, from Monday to Friday, I might read about wines or drink a glass of wine. On the weekend, I might go on a workshop for a day and learn how to recognize wines better or to taste wines. And for travel, I might go to a great wine producer and learn about the history of wine and how they produce it. And this is what is essentially called serious leisure in the tourism literature. Now, there is also the idea that, well, if you look at this from the inside, this is essentially a questioning of the world, and they are pursuing something that is, in their opinion, higher in terms of value than what other people are pursuing. If you look at it from the outside, what you can find is some of the patterns that people found when they did class analysis back to Marx. So if you look at who these postmodern people are, well, they are people who tend to live in very developed societies. They are people who tend to live in the city. They are people who don't tend to have a lot of material problems on their hands. So can everybody question reality, or rather, can everybody afford to question reality? If I have plenty of immediate problems on my hands, like I'm not employed, or I can't get food for my kids, then am I going to question reality, or am I going to get busy and go and solve my immediate problems? So in that sense, from an outside perspective, this is a potential middle class phenomenon, rather than something that's a general trend. But again, whether this is true is for you to decide, because at the same time, you go outside in London and you see all of these rather poor university students who are outside protesting and questioning reality, who are clearly not middle class, but they are a part of this trend. So whether class has to do with it is again something for you to consider. And if you assume that class has something to do with it, then of course you can link the idea of going on an individual journey as a part of the process of gathering cultural capital. So the middle class likes to go and learn how to recognize the great paintings, the great sculptures, likes to go and learn about the world, or to gather, in other words, cultural capital. So authenticity really is something that is very, very complicated and connected with a number of social phenomena that have been developing for a fairly long time. But when you look at the concept itself, it also has a history in terms of the way that it emerged and the way that theorists categorize authenticity. So if you look, for instance, back in magazines of the 1910s and the 1920s in the UK, there were people that were looking for authenticity in travel back then. Of course, that meant something else than what it means today. But even if you look at, for instance, people like Koebel, who went on a trip with Thomas Cook and Son, what he demanded from the agency was a trip where he is pushed and not led, which means that he goes on a trip where they take him somewhere, but he's not a part of a group and he can interact with the people. And this is what he believed was authentic. This is what he was pursuing. Now, so is this really something that has to do with postmodernism? Well, clearly not. But is this something that is different from what we are pursuing today? Well, that's a question for you to think about. Now, when you think about authenticity, usually these ideas are associated with anthropologists. So anthropologists clearly do a lot of work on the ground, so they go and integrate themselves within local communities, and then they write ethnographies about their experiences. So clearly for them, authenticity is a big issue, and it's something that they, well, in some way at least, seek. Well, so some of the contemporary theorists believe that authenticity is impossible to achieve. So this is the first type of theorists that I've at least identified. Now, the second type of theorists believe that the subjective traveler, rather than an external criteria, defines authenticity. So what does that mean? Well, authenticity is different for everybody. If you believe it's authentic, then it's authentic. If you do not, then it is not. There is no criteria that fits everybody. But then also you have other theorists that believe that authenticity is an inherent feature of all travel. So it doesn't matter where you're traveling, how you're traveling. There is certainly a part of it that is somewhat authentic. And how do we know this? Well, the way that they defined authenticity was in opposition to everyday routine or to everyday work. So again, whether these are definitions or groups of theorists that relate to your work or that you want to engage with is something that you can explore on your own. So when you think about tourism, clearly you have a tremendous amount of types of tourism. So you have urban, farm, cultural, education, event tourism, health and spa, etc. You even have concepts like pilgrimage. So pilgrimage, obviously religious tourism, is also something that's particularly interested that I actually glanced over before but never spoke about. If you think about the first mass trips in history, in terms of the masses, not the elites, where they happened was, well, primarily in Europe when people from the 11th century onwards started to go on pilgrimage trips to Jerusalem. And in many ways you could argue that the church was the first tour operator in the world by getting people to go in large groups together to one certain place for travel. But in any case, there are different types of tourism that come with different demands. And back in '72, so this is, again, pay attention to what this time period is. This is a part of modernity. This is a part of human history where people believed that they could understand the world through rationality and progress. There were people like Cohen who made typologies of tourists. So for instance, he would have the drifter, the explorer, the individual mass tourist, and the organized mass tourist. Now, how do they differ? Well, clearly they are ranked from the person who is most adventurous to the person who is least adventurous, from most individualistic to least individualistic. Now, are these categories still basically relevant to our society today? So, are we indeed grouped into different types of tourists at all? And are they useful in any way? In what way are they useful if you use them? So can you make a claim that we have moved from a trend of organized mass tourists towards drifters, or from a trend of drifters towards organized mass tourists? What type of people belong to each category? And how is that relevant to the way that you frame your research is, well, something that that you need to think about. So one of the main, well, contradictions, I think, of postmodernity is a potential loss of meaning in general. And what I mean is, well, meaning in life, and something that you can consider is whether you have a meaning in life and whether you need a meaning in life to start with. So what happens if you have one? What happens if you don't have one? Well, if you're a postmodernist, what you believe is that knowledge is constructed through language. So any form of knowledge that you get from text, from people talking to you, etc., is a product of language that somebody created. Well, if you believe that all knowledge is language, then this means that now you know what knowledge is. And if you know what knowledge is, then you can start looking into who created it, why did they create it, was it created for somebody's benefit? Well, if you start looking into these things, then you can argue that you can deconstruct knowledge. And if you can deconstruct knowledge, then you can basically look for new types of knowledge that were previously hidden from us. So if you believe in this, again, this means that you begin to question the entire system, you begin to question authority. You should, if you're a postmodernist at this stage, begin to question whether I am here for some kind of a power purpose, whether I am trying to manipulate or impose authority on you in any way. What is my purpose, if any? And why am I here? So, of course, this is an extreme example, but well, if you're a postmodernist, then there are a whole lot of things that you can identify as imperialistic efforts, including school textbooks, for example. Who writes school textbooks when you're in high school? Well, the nation state. Why does the nation state write them that way? What kind of history do they teach you and why? So, again, you can flip it and then say, well, let's say that we stop teaching history to everybody. How is that helpful in any way? Is that going to help anybody really? Or is that going to cause chaos? So there is a great amount of issues at hand. So another problem is in this type of, confusion. What is your identity? Do you have an identity? If you question everything, then surely you can question the existence of your own identity. So one of the typologies of identity is on the board here and talks about a protean self. So some people have a self which keeps changing to adapt to the present circumstances. It talks about decentered self, which is the idea that there is no self at all. And it talks about self in relation. How are we positioned in this world in relation to everything that surrounds us? So if you're struggling to define your own identity, you're, most likely struggling to define any forms of meaning for yourself because you don't really know who you are to start with. And how is this relevant to tourism? Well, if you don't know who you are, the proposition of travel becomes extremely, extremely attractive. Why? Well, because if I don't know who I am, then I don't know if I belong to this country, to this city, to this family, to this space, to this area. And then, of course, why wouldn't I go and travel? So, the proposition of travel has a number of psychological, parallels and metaphors that it's related to. Well, first of all, travel is in certain ways a metaphor for life. Life is a journey. Life is something that we move through. And, there are, of course, also extreme theories that suppose that, movement means life and standing still means death. So in many ways, if you're not moving, you're dead. You're basically dead while you're alive, in that sense. Well, of course, that's a bit extreme, but it's one of the subconscious, potentially, effects of travel as a metaphor. The other potential idea is that of progress or change. So, if you don't believe that society is constantly progressing, then you might potentially go and seek change. Why? Because what is progress? Progress is, first of all, change. Change in a direction that I believe is in some way better than what I am, but it is change to start with. So, if you don't believe in the Marxian idea of progress in one direction, then you might go and seek change in a certain number of other ways, including travel. Another idea is, overcoming obstacles. So the society that we've built clearly provides us with a lot of comfort. Now, there are many of us who are, for some reason, predisposed to seeking obstacles. Why do people go rock climbing on weekends? Why do they go and sign up for activities like boxing? Why do they go and seek all kinds of obstacles to go through in their life? Well, even if you look at the way that ancient myths are structured, they're always about a hero that overcomes an obstacle. If you look at the scripts of great movies, what is a movie without a problem for the main character to solve? What is a script for great books? A struggle by the main character. So in many ways, you are looking for certain obstacles in your life. So perhaps there is a type of adventurous traveler who has been so much pampered by society that he now really needs to go and face something difficult because his life has been always easy and thus meaningless. So perhaps that is one of the meanings of travel for a new type of travelers that are emerging. Another effect of the psychological experience is discovery of self. So as we spoke at the beginning, when you are somewhere, especially if you're writing about this place, you write about it as yourself in opposition to others. So the more places that you go to, the more opportunities you go to compare yourself to the rest of the world. So you understand who you actually are. And of course, if you have lost your identity, as we just spoke about the loss of identity 2 minutes ago, then maybe you want to go and seek yourself. These ways of categorizing people perhaps have to do with groups that have shared interests. So if you are choosing the places where you travel and the people that you travel to, perhaps you have a shared interest with them in some way. So the other question is this bridging or is this creating greater class disparity between people? So if you think about tourism, what is the actual social effect? Are we all able to access tourist/traveler experiences, or is there even a greater gap between people who can now see the whole world and people who are still unable to see, well, any part of it except for the part where they live? If you look at the numbers, there are 1.4 billion tourist arrivals, well, last year, and then of course we spoke about the problems with the definition of tourist to start with. So this is in total, even if we take this number at face value without questioning it, this is still 20% of the world population. Well, what about the 80% that's left that did not travel internationally and that stayed within their own country? Of course, if you actually discard the people that did not travel as tourists, you're probably going to end up with something much lower, like 10% of people. And of course, 10% is the dreaded number. When you look at things like economic analysis, you always speak about the top 10% of people and the bottom 90%. So is tourism just another expression of this inequality? Of course, you have the other problem of service level, different levels of services, 5-star hotels versus local accommodation in hostels, difference in services. So is the type of tourism that elite and masses experience the same? Do they go to the same type of places, restaurants, hotels? And what does that mean in the broader picture? Well, apart from the experiential gap, what you run into is a great problem of travel and relationality. So how does travel reshape our relations, the relations that we have with each other? To start with, so when you look at different types of travel, when you look at traveling solo, on your own, when you look at traveling with friends, look at traveling with a partner or a spouse and with a family, these reveal very, very different ways of conceptualizing relationality. So there has been this tremendous rise of people traveling solo. If you look at the data, which of course implies there is a rise in the trend of individualism. And I don't mean individualism necessarily in the way that you define your goals for life, and you want financial independence. I mean individualism literally. You're literally there on your own. You disconnect yourself from your society and just go. When you're traveling with friends, is the purpose of your travel to connect with your friends? Or is the purpose of your travel to experience local culture? When did the idea of traveling with friends start being popular? And the other thing is, if you look at Western societies, in the UK, for example, all university students, bachelor students, when they get a little bit of money on their hands, the first thing they do is they go and buy tickets to go and travel somewhere. This is just a tremendous change in the way that people think about the world. People are, they've just moved on to this tremendous culture of travel. It's almost like, well, if we're friends, then one of the things we must do is go and travel. And what's even more shocking is that this has started to influence relationships. So I've been thinking about it for a while, and then a couple of weeks ago, I clicked on a long article. I think it was on RT, the Russia Today, the media channel, and there was this long analysis of how tourism changes relationships with our partners or spouses. So if you look at the way that, well, dating has started to work in large cities, people are getting increasingly busier, and the time that they spend together tends to be, well, for the most part, the time that they spend on a holiday together, and how, well, going together to travel or going for tourism has become an element, a necessary element of relationships in the modern world. Well, of course, you can relate this back to the idea of a honeymoon. When people get married, they go and travel. Why? Well, it's a question for you to think about. And it's also a question for you to think about whether we have all started going on honeymoons all the time, or whether we don't really have honeymoons anymore. So what is the social meaning of these changes? The other aspect is traveling with family. There is a great number of research actually on this. So if you've seen people trying to measure benefits for families, so families that go and create memories, ways that travel strengthens relationships between the family, experiences for children, and also happiness. There are attempts to measure the relationship between happiness and family travel. So how has this changed the family as a modern institution? Is travel the only time when we actually get the whole family together these days, especially if the children go away to study? This is another social aspect of the influence of travel and tourism in general. Also, you have, of course, relationships with local people, or also relationships with other travelers. They're, in most cases, temporary. Why are people seeking these relationships, or are they seeking them to start with, or is this just a byproduct of the rise of tourism? The other thing that has changed tourism remarkably is, of course, the change in relations between genders. So if you think about the rise in solo travelers, of course, a lot of these people are now women that have gone traveling alone, which was not the case historically. If you think about changing relationships and the way that we have conceptualized, dating through travel in the city in many ways, how is this a result or a consequence of changes in the relations between genders and travel as a rising phenomenon? So all of this, of course, when you talk about family, has been called the kinship economy by some analysts. So is this an economy where you base your experiences and preferences based on kinship and relationship to other people that you share experiences with? So the central question that we started with was really, what is the social meaning of travel and tourism? And out of this lecture, there is a tremendous amount of information that you can take and use for a number of purposes. Well, the first purpose is to go and actually think about the concepts that you're analyzing, to think whether you actually understood and defined things like sustainability and authenticity appropriately, at least for the scope of your research. The second thing that you can take away is, well, you can reflect on yourself. Who are you? Are you a part of postmodernism? Are you a part of modernism? Do you believe that these things in fact shape society? Do you believe these sociological theories to start with? If you don't believe them, why don't you believe them, and how so? Or if you believe them, then what do they tell us? If you look at the trends of tourism or the habits of tourists, based on the habits of a tourist or tourist groups, can you actually understand what stage of development their society is at? If you look at big groups of mass tourists, can you assume that this means they are at an industrial stage of development? If you look at individual tourists, can you assume that they passed this stage without even speaking to them? So how can you actually understand the world by just applying these theories? And the opposite of course, is another question. If you know about a society, so if you know that a society is now in an industrial period, can you predict that there will be a rise in mass tourism? And if you can predict that, of course, if you're a social scientist, well, what does this mean in terms of research? If you go into business, well, how is this an opportunity that you can capitalize on? So these theories can reveal a lot about the world. And of course, does this represent global change or global progress? Are these trends one-directional, or is this just a trend that's going back and forth between travel and tourism? So if you look at travel before the 19th century, we had primarily travel. Then we had mass tourism. And now, in advanced Western economies, we're back to travel. How did this happen? Was this progress? Is the first and the second type of travel similar or different? And of course, how did you define travel and tourism in the first place? Is something else you need to clarify. And, well, two of the final things are, what have you learned about yourself? Or what can you learn about yourself? How do you fit into this equation? And how does your society, your surroundings, how do they fit into this? And how can you actually understand the context of the time period that you live in and your own habits? So overall, I hope that you will go away with a better understanding of the relationship between tourists and society. That's pretty much everything I've got to tell you. And if you have any questions, I'll happily take them. Or if you don't, we can leave it for seminar discussions tomorrow.
I have to go to the meeting.
Okay, that's excellent. So thanks very much for listening. And
I like it a lot.
thanks.
That's no.
Well, I hope it's useful in some way.